So please welcome Dan May and Rachel Gillis. I hope I am pronouncing your names correctly. Okay.
Yes.
And the talk title is Creative Writing in Upper Division Math, Poetry Baked into Pie. Please.
Great. Yes. Thanks, folks. Well, yeah. Okay. So, yeah. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Dan May, and Rachel Gillis, a student of mine. We're both from Black Hills State University, and you know, folks, you all were sort of like blowing my mind yesterday. I spent a lot of time overnight thinking about some of the things that came up in some of our conversations yesterday. You know, during our discussion of imposter syndrome. I don't remember who exactly said this, but someone pointed out this concept that a piece of imposter syndrome is the idea of inviting students into the vernacular of the academic world. And I have really been thinking about this a whole lot. You know, of all of my various identities, you know, mathematician, poet, researcher, I think the identity that is most present for me on most days is that of teacher. And you know, so I thought I would say a little bit about, you know, the university, the institution where Rachel and I both are. You know, Black Hills State University is a small regional public university. We have a lot of first generation college students at our school. In fact, we have a lot of former first generation college students as faculty members at our university. Hi, that's me. And so we have a rural setting. You know, it's a very interesting paradigm. And in particular, in the context of inviting students into the vernacular, you know, this really is implicitly the way I spend a lot of my energy, and sometimes quite explicitly. You know, we're sort of here in a red state, surrounded by other red states, and this concept of you know, like, well, inviting students into this academic world is very front and center in my mind quite a bit. And one of the ways I do try to do that is by working towards a new sort of maybe interdisciplinary vernacular. And so I guess I wanted to give a little bit of background on myself here. You know, like, I think in some ways poetry was destined to land in my math teaching. Part of the point of giving some of these biographical details is to sort of point out that sometimes some of these seeds of creative endeavors can take, you know, years or decades to even flourish. I suppose that is if you believe in continuous time, and I know some folks here are maybe like a little bit skeptical of the concept of continuous time. And I am open to the idea, you know, that the person who's sitting here right now talking to you about mixing poetry in upper division math class is the same person as the 18-year-old who started college in Casper College right here, and was sort of avoiding doing his differential equations homework by like writing long poems and long short stories, and sort of like setting myself back by just, you know, what I thought at the time was distracting myself from my serious work. I moved to Montana State University, and this imposter syndrome followed me at every stage. My biographical details here are sort of, I have these big piles of lumps known as mountains here. I always find this sort of physical setting very grounding for me. You know, when I was at Montana State University, it was the same thing. I was trying to avoid my real analysis homework by hunkering down and reading long novels. You know, and anything I could do to distract myself from what, again, I thought was the serious work. You know, this imposter syndrome was very internal for me during this stage in my career. You know, externally, it was very easy for me to navigate the math world, you know, as a sort of like straight, white, able-bodied male. It was very easy for me to sort of pass, but on the inside, I was being very distracted by all of these creative pursuits and really didn't feel like I belonged. And that really came to a head when I became a graduate student. And I think that, you know, many of us have experienced this idea that there is sort of a right way to be a graduate student and a wrong way to be a graduate student in mathematics. And in my case, certainly the wrong way was to devote any of my energy to creative pursuits. And paradoxically, I now realize that not following those creative urges actually delayed my completion of graduate school. It took me 8 years to finish my PhD, which felt like a long time. And I do think that part of that is because I wasn't allowing this other corner of myself to flourish. And so eventually I decided to sort of let that go. We had an interesting conversation yesterday about when is something finished? When is a proof finished? I'm very interested in this question as it pertains to when is a poem finished? And, you know, maybe things are never finished, but maybe a certain stage of things are finished when you actually tell someone about it. And when I got here to my current position, I decided to tell people about who I really was, that I had interest in blending, well, mathematics and poetry. And I had given a talk at a interdisciplinary lecture series that we have on our campus about the history of math and poetry. And sort of the third person in Rachel and my collaboration who isn't present speaking to us today, but is present in spirit, is Dr. Courtney Hughes-Wyka, who is an English professor at our university and really an accomplished poet. She was at this lecture that I gave, and she heard me sort of spouting these goofy things about the history of math and poetry and some of my ideas about how we could explore new mathematical poetic forms. And she said, well, let's try that out in one of my, senior level poetry writing classes. And this, openness from, a quote unquote, well, she is a real poet inviting me into that, legitimate space of poetry was really transformational, and has really set me on a sort of new career path. So all of these biographical details are in the background for me sort of all the time. But like most of us, in our teaching practice, 2020 was a very sort of crisis year. And I was sort of planning my number theory course in August of 2020, and I was sort of in crisis mode. I hate to bring up the COVID curve here in South Dakota, but like in many places, it peaked. And when I was planning this class, I didn't know exactly. We were sort of in this area. But, we sort of had a sense that the curve would do what it would eventually do. And it became very difficult. I had wanted to design this class in a certain way, and that was going to be completely impossible. We had this high flex model where folks were sort of simultaneously in the room and on Zoom. I don't want to give the impression here, by the way, that many math ed majors in the class was a crisis. That part of it is not a crisis. But that part of it did inform the way I managed the planning of this class. We were expecting lots of absences. We just kind of knew that a lot of different things were going to be like difficult. And so I sort of finally freed myself fully and completely and ultimately from the expectations of what, a number theory course should look like, and brought all of those different parts of my identity that I had talked about before into our class. And I just sort of had a kitchen sink approach to this class. We threw everything in here, all the various kinds of ways that students could learn number theory. And all of these things were optional. And of course, this class needed poetry as well. Now, I'm open to the criticism that, well, perhaps are these students not learning enough number theory to prepare them for like graduate studies in number theory? And, maybe that is the case. My goal, though, really was to focus on this different paradigm that foregrounds creativity and imagination and open-ended play. And I do hope that some of the teachers, because there were a lot of future math teachers in this class, are being set up for a different kind of long-term success other than being ready to be like a rock star in a graduate level number theory class, because that's not where a lot of the folks are headed. Well, I encouraged my number theory students to write poetry. I gave them sort of the instructions that you see on the screen here. We in the mathematical poetic community sometimes think about there being sort of 3 categories of mathematical poetry. You can kind of read those on the screen. Alice Major, I think she is very into poems which use the mathematical language metaphorically. So she really is an expert at that. And our friend Rachel here is going to talk to us in a little bit about mathematically structured poetry. But students were also invited to present these things at sort of an online symposium at the end of the semester. And I would say this was really a great success. Quite a few students participated in this. I wound up having many students submit poetry to me. Among them, Rachel. And Rachel, I don't know if you remember this, but it was like about 1 year and 1 day ago from right now, this date that you and I first talked about your poetry. And Rachel's poetry was so profound, so moving, had such depth here. It really did move me to tears. It really placed me backwards in my life into previous circumstances. And I mean, it had me calling friends that I hadn't talked to in a decade. And this is like really was sort of my dream of a math class, that we would be learning number theory, but we would also be doing this other kind of creative and emotional work, and sort of blurring some of the distinctions between some of these things. And so I think I've hopefully, not used up too much of my time here, Rachel, but yes, we should sort of, oh, and by the way, one other thing I wanted to say is that I also do a lot of work with the honors program at our university. And so when Rachel was bringing me this just copious amount of mathematical poetry and had all of this like sort of long-term, she had a vision, like Rachel had and has a vision for where her body of poetic work is going. And so as a person in the honors program, I sort of gave her the hard sell about trying to recruit her into the program to turn this into an honors project. And Rachel, I think I will pass the mic over to you now.
All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, my name is Rachel Gillis. Just a little bit about me. I graduated from Henrietta High School in the small town of Henrietta, Texas. One of the biggest things I remember most of high school was sitting in class, writing poetry in spirals instead of probably paying attention to my teachers. Poetry became a really big part of my life. By the time I was a senior in high school, it was more of a hobby than it was anything that I took seriously. And then after taking 2 years off, I realized what I wanted to pursue in life and attended Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, Texas, just a small town over from where I grew up. By this time in my life, my poetry was something that was very private. I wrote mostly confessional poetry, and I used it as a coping mechanism to kind of deal with my experiences in college for the first time. Then I met my now husband, who's in the U.S. Air Force, and he was stationed in Rapid City, South Dakota. So I transferred schools to Black Hills State University in Spearfish, South Dakota, where I am set to graduate in fall of 22 with a bachelor's in math education. This is where my poetry really went from just a hobby to something more than I could have ever imagined it being. Yeah, so here are some of my experiences in math. My first real encounter with teaching math was whenever I was in high school. I tutored a lot of elementary kids, like my mom was an elementary school teacher, so I helped her a lot out. And I also would host like study sessions at my house, and I would like always be helping my friends like with their math homework. So that was kind of like my first encounters with teaching math. So when I finally decided to chase after my education dreams, it kind of hit me what exactly I was getting myself into. My first upper level math class was trigonometry at MSU, and I was the only female in the class, and I sat very front row, and I was just like taking notes like crazy, just trying to focus on what I needed to learn. And it was very intimidating, to say the least. When I transferred to Black Hills State University, my first math class was with Dr. May. And even though some of us were still in line at the time, there was considerably more females, and I felt less alone than I did at MSU. And not only having more females in the class made me feel more confident in my career choices, but the way Dr. May designed his classes so we were able to learn in various ways, it helped a lot and in a way took some of the pressure off of me in a new school setting. Dr. May, he did a very beautiful job of describing of how he set up his classes. But yeah, his classes were set up in a way that allowed us to explore topics that were talked about in classes in multiple ways. And he also gave us a space to explore mathematics in other forms outside of number theory, which I thought was really interesting. So this is where I wrote my first poem I've ever really shared with anyone, called Infinity. And after receiving such positive feedback from Dr. May, I decided to turn my one poem into a collection of multiple poems using a combination of math poetry. And after bringing this idea up with Dr. May, he encouraged me to turn this collection into a chapbook for a capstone research project. The goal of the chapbook really will be to consist of my confessional poetry. It will tell the story of my life in a unique way. And I have since been working closely with Dr. May and also, as he mentioned, English professor and poet, Dr. Hughes Wyka. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. So this is actually a poem that soon to be part of my collection. And this is really talking about how I felt sitting in trigonometry in my first semester of college. Fall of 2017. My notes hung on my tangent heart. Heart bounces between man and pi over 2, then bounces again. Crossed ankles, taking notes from a man's hand. Relentless, like this pencil's guts, pushed out and smeared on paper, or this pressure that I belong in the kitchen writing recipes. Does anybody notice anything interesting about the structure of this poem?
I'm looking at the shape of the lines. And it's sort of, I don't know if that was intentional.
Kind of, yes. The line structure is definitely intentional.
Is it the number of syllables is based off of pi, the digits of pi?
The number of syllables? Yes.
Yeah, I checked the first few lines. Yeah, neat. I really like it.
And then there's also a second way that, so it's also lines per stanza. Yeah. And so, yeah, as you can see, like the first stanza is 3 lines, second stanza is 1, third, 4, so on and so forth. And then also, as you have mentioned, the syllables per stanza, or syllables per line, sorry, is also the number of pi. Yeah. So I thought that was really cool. And then here's a definition of what a Cadet poem is. The name of the form really comes from the letters' respective positions in the alphabet. And then, yeah, here's what I found easy about writing a Cadet. The first stanza is short and sweet, really sets the tone of the poem. Because the first stanza is so short and sweet, the main reason I found this to be so easy was because it reminded me of writing a tweet or like a quick update. And the last stanza is easy for me because I had something to like go back to tie it all together. But what I found difficult was like the first line, the first single line, I always find the perfect word and it's always more than 1 syllable. And it's very difficult to find the right word to fit there that's also the right syllable count. So I find that very difficult. And then I also find it difficult fitting in all of the imagery and saying everything I want to say in such a very small, limited space. But yeah, here's some tips and tricks. If you ever wanted to write one of these yourself, I suggest starting off with a simple line, something that really speaks to you, or a phrase that has been stuck in your head, and then pick a meaningful word from that line and expanding on what that word means to you, giving that word an action or even some character, and then make some bold statement. And then lastly, like tie it back, giving it imagery and emotion. And since this is the beefiest part of the poem, I suggest using it to your own advantage. Yeah. And then my future plans, I plan to teach high school level math. And I plan to motivate my students in math by combining literature and mathematics to kind of spark the creative side of my students, because I found that really interesting whenever I came into Dr. May's class. I really enjoyed that aspect. I also would like to encourage like people to not just work in math poetry, but like poetry in general and creative writing. I think that'd be really cool to host workshops like after school for that. And then so that way, like people who are writing poetry like I did in high school, and I just thought like, oh, no one's going to take this seriously. This is embarrassing almost. Like, who writes poetry? I want to create a safe space for those students who like do that as a hobby or even might be interested in it. And also I want to encourage my students to seek out mathematics in other ways, like outside of the classroom, a lot like Dr. May did.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm excited to watch your career develop and see sort of the great stuff that I know you're going to do with your students in the future. I've sort of been shouting from the tops of those mountains that I showed you all at the beginning of this presentation to everyone who will listen to me anywhere I go about how interesting this little side trail of mathematical poetry is if you want to follow it. And Rachel is the one who actually chose to walk down that path. So Rachel, the credit is definitely yours for exploring this. My goals are to continue to find ways to sort of integrate these poetry topics into more math classes, in a deeper way. There are a lot of established mathematical poetic forms that I don't know a whole lot about, and I'm still learning about those things. our collaboration with Professor Hughes-Wyka, as Rachel said, you know, has focused a lot on creating new mathematical poetic forms. We didn't talk about those too much in this talk, but we have some poetic forms based on, like, you know, different kinds of digraphs or the Fano plane. And we're going to continue to exploring those things. And then, you know, personally, I want to continue writing poetry. I find it very difficult sometimes to find the time to devote to my creative pursuits. And so that's kind of my goals. So yeah, thanks folks. Any comments or questions?
Thank you so much for this very inspiring sharing from both of you.
Thank you.
I'm actually,
yes.
I'm really excited about this because I'm going to talk about active learning, right? And like risk taking, and both of these like exactly fit that. And so it's great to see you and see other people engage students in different ways. So I really like this. And Rachel, like, go for it. Like, go for it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Daniel, I want to ask, like, I missed the first couple, right, because I was giving my talk, but
Sure.
I can just imagine, and I want to, like, Rachel, thank you for being, like, brave enough to say stuff like pencil guts, you know what I mean? Like, thank you for being, like, some of my writing can get a little, like, it's not dark, it's just explorative, you know what I mean? Or it's
Right.
like, I'm not afraid to write, like, infinite sadness. Like, I'm not afraid to, like, write those spaces, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I really like that you're talking about this, like, it's like you're suspended. It's like this place in between worlds. And it's like, perhaps I should be, you know, in the kitchen with the potatoes, you know what I mean? There's like
Yeah.
so I applaud you for being like haunting and like beautiful and like open, you know, at the same time. Cause I think a lot of people shut that down, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And like, they just don't say it. And it's like, oh, but that's what, it's like, that's the quiet space, you know what I mean? So
Yes.
I want to applaud you for letting us in to quiet
Thank you.
space, you know what I mean?
Yes. Thank you.
I like it. So like, can I ask where the pencil guts like smeared? I just love this like tactility, you know, I love touch and things like that.
Yes. So I am taking a poetry class with Dr. Hughes-Wyka currently, and one of our writing exercises was to write a list of words and then go through and pick one of those words and write like a short poem, like, but as a definition. And my word, like in my list, was the word relentless. And it was like really late at night, and I was like trying to do this thing, and I was like, relentless, like this pencil's guts pushed out on this paper kind of thing. And then it just like clicked. Yeah.
Wow. I love it. I have so many other, I know Yasmin has a question, but I just like I think it's like, we just have to start this thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like MathArt forever. And I mean, if you were Daniel and the brief correspondence I've had with him, it's like super visionary. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's very cool.
Yeah, Rachel, your writing is very visceral. And so I, you know, Shauna, I agree with you when I encountered this line for the first time. Yeah, this is very striking. So I you know, encourage you to continue exploring these really like visceral imageries that you do.
Right?
Yeah, Yazdan, I see your hand there.
Okay, thank you very much for both of you. It was very inspiring. I have only one question. I know we don't have that much time. Would you please tell me how I can find some of the materials that you were showing us? I think in the beginning you have some books or something, Dan, and you know the things that you know you have done, Rachel, for the poetry. Because I have a class. You know, I am an engineer, but I teach all of the things, you know, physics, mathematics, chemistry. So one of the things is that pre-calculus that I'm teaching this semester, the students are freshmen. So they have some difficulty. And I think the ideas that you have for poetry will motivate many of them. So how I can find some of these things that you have? Thank you.
I can maybe address this, Rachel. And then maybe if you have anything to add. Yazdan, I wrote a long book chapter on these mathematical poetic forms that I can share with you. You know, this is like, I believe this definition of a cadet here is taken from that chapter. And then there's a little bit of history of mathematical poetic form and a whole lot of other forms that you know, could in theory suggest that your students explore. So that's maybe one reference I can point you in the direction of. Rachel, do you have any particular references or like materials that you have been enjoying using?
I use the chapter that you wrote a lot. That's pretty much probably one of my biggest sources of information. Yeah, I also like Google a lot of like Kidde poems, because there's like people like these are kind of popular, or not really popular, but like other people do them. So I just kind of Google and kind of see what I can find as well. I don't know, that's probably not very helpful.
No, I think it is. I think it is. And, you know, I'm like frantically looking around at all my stacks of books here. I don't think I have it close to my desk here. There is a wonderful anthology edited by Sarah Glass and Joanne Growney called Strange Attractors, Poems of Love and Mathematics. And I will send you a citation for that also, because I think this book is particularly helpful for introducing your students to sort of category 2 on the screen here of mathematical poetry. You know, this book is just an anthology of poets exploring mathematical language as a metaphor for love. So there's a couple citations I can send you, Yazd, and hopefully you find them helpful.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Daniel, can you talk any more about these like other forms? Because, you know, I'm always trying to do the category thing. I'm like, I'm making an infinity unicorn category. So like, have y'all tried? I mean, just like experience, like I want to join, you know, let's have like poetry, like, I don't know, spoken word, math.
Well, yeah. I mean, so, you know, it is as a little sort of a teaser or a preview here. My joint meetings talk. My plan for the talk of the joint meetings is to introduce more of these forms. I suppose, you know, in like the context of an infinite poem, one of my favorite things that Dr. Hughes Wyka and I have worked on in the past is we have written poetry to these sort of like digraphs. And, you know, if you sort of like, if each one of your stanzas or like cantos in your poem represents the node of a digraph, and if you do this so that the sort of underlying digraph has cycles, what we'd sort of like to do is label our directed edges with like a line of poetry. And so it's sort of like a choose your own adventure, like journey through the poem. And it really is an infinite process. So, you know, like something you read as the first stanza, you know, if maybe your sort of underlying digraph has like 5 vertices or something, and you might not cycle back around to that section until after 4 other stanzas, and so you might read it again, but you know, you're sort of reading it with new information that you have picked up along the way from some of your other nodes. And so, you know, if there's cycles, you can sort of cycle through this infinitely, and you know, encountering a new section multiple times can bring with it sort of new meaning that wasn't there before.
I love Miku. He's speaking at our JMN. Beth, are you here? Yeah, this is Daniel. Remember, I was like, can we give him 5 slots? Yeah. Anyway, Beth is my quote. So you meeting Daniel right now. I was like, you have to talk at this one too. We need to give Dan a whole block of time so he can actually like do this. And Miku, you'll be there too. So it's like fun. Oh my God, very exciting. I love it. Rachel, I love it. Like, please continue, inspire. Weirdest shapes, infinite poems. They just keep going. I love how you can actually make that, you know, I love it. Yeah. Make it like the infinite book. It's so cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, cool. That's kind of the goal. We'll see.
Awesome. Yay. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.